Hey, it's Bill with St. Pierre Woodworking, and this week I'm going to go over 10 things on how you can improve your woodworking and probably save a finger or two. Don't screw up your glue up. So to keep your boards from warping, the best way that I've found over the last 35 years is to use the quarter sawn boards in the middle of a glue up. That's right here where your grain is actually going straight up and down. That piece came from the center of the log. Then as I work on the outside of the glue up, I'll use my rift sawn boards and my flat sawn boards. That way there, I don't have as much warpage in the center of the table. I don't expect warpage, but you never know. It doesn't have to be because your boards are dry. Sometimes it's just a stress in the tree that'll make a board warp. So I always use the quarter sawn boards in the center of my glue ups and move from rift sawn to flat sawn as I work my way out on the glue up. If you want to save money in woodworking, stop applying so much glue. I've seen a lot of people over the years just putting so much glue on there, it's just running down the sides of the board. When they clamp the boards up, they're actually just squeezing all the glue out, applying so much pressure that your clamps are basically almost bending. You're going to end up with a mess and dents in your boards from your clamps. I just like to put enough glue on there to completely cover the board, a thin layer, with a little bit of pressure with the clamps, and that's all it takes. You don't need to put a ton of glue on there, so it's just more work for yourself and more money in glue. All right, so this next one might draw some lines. This is one that several people go different ways with. But if you took wood class back in the 70s or 80s, you were taught how to store a block plane. Sounds simple, but there is a proper way to store a block plane. This is not the proper way, because remember, there's a little blade coming out the bottom of this block plane. So if you're actually storing your block planes on the side, and the reason a block plane is so flat on the sides is obviously to get into tight edges, but also so you can store your block plane the way they used to want you to store your block plane on the side. I don't store my block planes that way. Even though every time I did this, my woodshop teacher would have a fit. I don't know how many times I had to stay after and sweep the shop. So if you're gonna store them like this, to me personally, it's safer this way because your blade is now hidden. Unless you're storing it on a concrete floor and you're moving it back and forth, you're gonna damage the blade. But if you're just putting this on your bench or on your shelf, to me, I don't see a problem with this. Now there's gonna be a lot of people out there saying, oh my gosh, you can't do that. I disagree. I actually have this little piece of rubber and I store my block planes on that piece of rubber over on my shelf. You can also store your block planes in a box if they came with a box. This is obviously a very high-end block plane. So if you're always wondering about how to store your block plane, I do put mine on the rubber just in case, but I don't feel this is necessary. In woodworking, I prefer square screws. Why? Because when you put a Phillips screw on the Phillips bit, and if I just barely move this thing a little bit, you're always trying to keep that thing in the board, and it usually takes two hands to do so. Because if I'm trying to get it started, anyway, you get the point. Square screws allow me to use the drill with one hand. I can move the bit around, I can do everything, I can get up underneath, and it's as simple with a square screw. That's why I've been using square screws for the past 20 years. And the Phillips screws, not even really sure why I even had these in the drawer, but they're obsolete to me. A handsaw comes with a lot of teeth for a reason. If you do it this way, it's going to take you twice as long, take more energy, and you're probably going to not have quite a good cut. To use the whole saw, you get an accurate cut, and you usually cut a little bit faster. So always use the whole saw when cutting a board with a handsaw. I actually cover all my outlets with blue tape that I'm not using, especially if they're around the area that I'm using the saws a lot and there's a lot of fine dust. But there is dust in your shop, it gets into your outlets, and it's a fire hazard. If you look around my shop, you'll see blue tape everywhere. It's a lot easier than those little push-in things which you can get to. But if you're using the outlets all the time, we've always got some blue tape here. It's just easy, just rip the tape off, stick it beside the outlet, use the outlet, put the tape back on, and you're done. It's just a quick little thing to keep the dust out of your outlets and keep the fire hazards down to a minimum. So one of my really big pet peeves in the shop is trip hazard, because I actually almost ended my career by tripping and falling into a table saw that was running, and my natural instinct was to put my hand down. How did I trip? I had my air hose running across the floor and literally rolled on the air hose and fell into the table saw. Do not have trip hazards around any saw. Anything that's going to make you trip or fall towards that machine is a problem. So we keep all of our air hoses, all of our cords wrapped up when we can. And if we're using a machine, we make sure that all that stuff is out of the way. Anything that you can trip on or slip on, you don't want near a machine that you're actually using. A lot of guys actually struggle with squaring legs up on a table. You'd be surprised the amount of people have asked me, how do I get the leg square? You gotta have a joiner. You're actually gonna get one side of that leg flat. And then once you run that through the joiner, you're gonna turn that side towards the fence. And if your fence is perfectly square with your bed, then those two sides are now perfectly square. All the planer's doing is following the contour that you're putting it through there. It's not actually making things square if the bottom isn't square to the top. So you really need to have those two sides perfectly square and then let the planer square up the other two sides. The planer and the joiner are working together to make this leg perfectly square. Anything with a lacquer finish on it, we don't go any more than 150, and we use a finishing sander on that. We don't use like a Rotex or something else or a belt sander. We have to use a finishing sander because you will get those little swirly marks in there if you don't use a nice finishing sander to get all the scratch marks out. So with lacquer, we go down to 150. If we're putting in oil on a tabletop or any other piece of furniture, we'll take it all the way down to 300, 400, 500 grit sandpaper, even beyond sometimes. It all depends on the sheen. So if you're gonna do an oil finish on it, you can start with your 80 grit, 120 grit, 150 grit, but then you're gonna start getting into where it almost looks like you're not even doing anything with that sandpaper. But you actually are. And if you take and put a lacquer finish on something that you just put 1,000 grit sandpaper on, you're basically closing all those pores up, and that lacquer is not going to penetrate into that wood. And oil will, but the lacquers won't. If you're doing an oil finish, take it as far as you want. If you're doing a lacquer finish, I recommend not going any further than 150 grit. This is the way we do it, and it's always worked for me. And I'm not talking the last 3 years, I'm talking the last 30 years. The most important thing to me in my shop is making sure that everything from our sawmills down to our chisels are sharp. If your saw blades aren't sharp and you're trying to get by on a project and you're pushing that wood through or you're forcing that into the machine, it's not only hard on the machine, it's hard on your project, and it's hard on you. And it causes you to make more mistakes and slip hazards if you're trying to push through a dull blade. And if you think a dull blade isn't going to cut you as bad as a sharp blade, you are wrong. It could probably cut you worse. We are constantly changing out our blades. We take them out, we have them resharpened, and they come back. As soon as we start to see burn marks, usually on wood, or we can tell by the sound of the machine when the blades are getting dull, they're coming off that machine. You may just have some pitch buildup behind the teeth, and it's as simple as taking that saw blade off and washing that with some 409 or something. We spray the blade, we clean it, we wipe it off, and it's just like a brand new blade again. For your best interest, always keep all your saw blades sharp. These are things that I've actually lived, so if I can pass that on to you guys, I think that's great. If you like what you saw, go ahead and subscribe.